On a pale and wind-stirred morning in July 1943, the first trucks rolled to a halt outside Camp Concordia in north-central Kansas, their engines ticking as heat began to gather across the open plains. The men who stepped down were remnants of the Afrika Korps, captured during the last collapsing battles around Bezirdi and Cape Bon barely weeks earlier, when the final Allied push had crushed all resistance across Tunisia. Their boots met the crushed gravel with a muted crunch, and many blinked against the unfamiliar horizon, a wide, treeless sweep of farmland so different from the wadis and ridgelines where they had made their stand. The Kansas wind carried the scent of cut hay and dust, but to the prisoners it felt sharp and foreign, a signal that they had crossed not just an ocean but a boundary into the unknown. Years of instruction from German officers told them that this was where dignity ended and punishment began, where the victorious enemy would remind them of defeat, one harsh gesture at a time. As the column formed ranks, American MPs walked beside them, reading names from manifests and issuing simple directions with a tone that contradicted every expectation the prisoners had been fed. No rifle butts prodded their backs, no barking threats cut through the morning air. A sergeant reminded one group to stay in line for their own safety, and the casual phrasing unsettled more than any raised voice might have. One corporal from the 104th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, shivering despite the growing warmth, kept repeating to himself a warning he had heard on the transport ship, that American camps were places of scarcity and humiliation, places where a man disappeared into monotony and hunger. Then came the moment that none of them could reconcile with those warnings. As the wind tugged at his tunic, the shivering corporal noticed a young guard pause beside him, tap the bottom of a Lucky Strike pack, and extend a single cigarette without a word. Around them, conversations stopped. The corporal stared, unsure whether this was mockery or a trick meant to strip away his remaining pride. But when the guard struck a match and shielded it from the wind with a practiced cupped hand, the flame's brief glow carried no threat. The corporal leaned forward, drew in the first harsh taste of American tobacco, and exhaled into the Kansas air with a confusion deeper than fear. Later, several prisoners would recall the same impression, that the cigarette's warmth undermined years of propaganda more effectively than any speech could. As the guard moved on, and the column resumed its slow march toward the intake barracks, the moment lodged itself in the collective memory of the group. In that small, quiet exchange, one made of paper, tobacco, and an unexpected ounce of respect, the men sensed that captivity in the United States would not resemble the bleak warnings they had carried from North Africa. It was only the first hint, a faint signal carried on the wind, of the deeper contradictions and revelations that awaited them once the routine of camp life began to unfold. The next phase of their journey would reveal how those early cracks in expectation widened into something far more disorienting than hardship alone. On the long road to that Kansas morning, the story turned first through the dust and ruin of Tunisia in early 1943, when the Afrika Korps, battered but unbroken, attempted to hold together a shrinking front under the weight of converging Allied armies. In January and February, the men had still spoken with a kind of grim confidence, recalling how they had once pushed deep into Egypt and nearly reached the Nile. But the tide had shifted beyond recovery. To the south and east, General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army pressed forward from Libya with the momentum gained after El Alamein, driving the Axis forces back from the old defensive belts and across the formidable terrain, leading toward the Marath Line. To the west, the freshly reinforced US, the 2nd Corps, still learning hard lessons after Kasserine Pass, began applying increasing pressure as American formations coordinated more effectively with British and French units. The Axis retreat soon became a tightening spiral, each withdrawal drawing them nearer to a final stand they knew they could not win. By March 1943, the collapse of the Marath Line signaled the end of any realistic hope for holding southern Tunisia. Once Sfax and Gab's, two critical supply ports, fell into Allied hands, the Afrika Korps found itself fighting with rations cut to fractions of their former allotments and resupply convoys reduced to a gamble against Allied air patrols. Cigarette stocks, once a small comfort in the deserts, monotony became so inconsistent that units sometimes rationed individual sticks as carefully as ammunition. Veteran soldiers later recalled how the absence of tobacco became a symbol of their deteriorating logistical situation. Where once German supply officers could promise regular Red Cross parcels, they now dealt in shortages and uncertainty. Through April, the defensive ring around Tunis shrank under constant artillery bombardment and the roar of Allied fighters sweeping overhead from newly secured airfields. The Axis command knew that Allied naval dominance in the Mediterranean had severed their lifeline. Even emergency attempts to ferry in fuel or ammunition often ended with Italian ships sunk before they neared the coast. German units dug in among rocky ridgelines near Mature Ferryville and the approaches to Cape Bon, fighting not in the expectation of breakthrough but simply to delay the inevitable. The air grew thick with smoke and exhaustion, and the once proud Afrika Korpsmen who had served under Rommel and marched across the sands with a reputation for discipline found themselves isolated, cut off, and steadily overwhelmed. The end came swiftly after weeks of attrition. On the 12th of May, 1943, Lieutenant General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the last organized Axis forces in Tunisia, leading to the capture of more than 275,000 German and Italian troops. A capitulation surpassed only by Stalingrad in scale. Many of the prisoners were gathered into makeshift enclosures around Mature and Ferryville, where Allied guards maintained firm regulation but, to the prisoners' confusion, adhered to the Geneva Convention with consistency. The men received water, medical attention, and orderly processing, contradicting the dire warnings they had been taught to expect about Allied brutality. These early encounters planted the first seeds of doubt, subtle but persistent, as the prisoners waited in the dust and heat for transport orders that would determine their future. When rumors swept through the camps that thousands be shipped across the Atlantic to the United States, the reaction was a mixture of dread, disbelief, and the strange numbness that follows total defeat. For men who had never imagined leaving Europe, the idea of captivity in a distant, industrial giant seemed to sever the last ties to the world they had known. Yet that tension born in the final, crumbling weeks of the Desert War would become the emotional bridge linking their battlefield collapse to the unexpected gestures of humanity they would later find in America. As the transport columns finally formed and the long journey began, none could foresee how profoundly those small moments abroad would challenge everything they believed about their enemy. In the weeks after the Afrika Korps surrendered, the long path toward the American heartland began at the dusty transit camps scattered around Mature, Ferryville, and Bizerte, where Allied officers sorted, registered, and reorganized tens of thousands of prisoners for shipment overseas. By late May 1943, columns of German POWs were marched through the ruined outskirts of Bizerte toward the docks, where rows of Liberty ships, freighters, and requisition troop transports lined the harbor. Similar scenes unfolded at Oran in Algeria, where additional contingents of prisoners, some still bandaged from their final battles, near Cape Bon, waited in the fierce Mediterranean sunlight for boarding orders. Many of these men had expected rough handling or even retribution after surrendering. Instead, they found themselves processed with an efficiency that puzzled them, as American MPs offered clear instructions but little hostility. The first hints of their future came in the sight of the ships themselves, symbols of the vast Allied industrial output that had overwhelmed their supply lines only weeks earlier. Once groups of several hundred were moved up gangways and into the dark interior of the transports, the reality of the crossing began. The former cargo holds, hastily converted for human transport, were fitted with three-tier wooden bunks bolted into the steel framework. The smell of oil, salt water, and newly cut lumber clung to the air. As hatches closed overhead and the convoy began to assemble, the prisoners felt the distinct unease of confinement inside a ship controlled by the enemy. Far from any battlefield they recognized, German officers among them knew that the U-boat arm, though weakened by mounting losses in the spring of 1943, still posed a threat, and many privately feared that a torpedo would send ship and prisoners alike to the bottom. Each night, the rumble of engines and the rhythmic vibration of propellers were reminders that the convoy was moving through waters contested by the very submarines some of the prisoners once considered their greatest protectors. Life below deck settled into a routine shaped by American discipline. Roll calls, ration distribution, and brief supervised visits to the open deck marked the passing days. The rations tinned meat, bread, and small portions of fruit or vegetables. Astonished, men who had survived the final weeks in Tunisia on half-spoiled supplies and inconsistent meals. Yet cigarettes, which had grown into rare treasures during the desert collapse, remained tightly rationed on the crossing. Guards smoked sparingly on deck, and the drifting scent of American tobacco served only to reinforce German anxieties that their coming captivity might be stricter than the brief calm aboard ship suggested. Some POWs claimed later that the scarcity felt deliberate, a prelude to deprivation, though the truth likely reflected logistical priorities rather than punishment. Despite their limited contact with guards, a few interactions unsettled long-held assumptions. Men with shrapnel injuries or dysentery were examined by American medics who treated them with clinical professionalism rather than anger. Water was issued regularly, and the rules, though firm, were predictable in a way that contrasted with the chaotic final days of the Tunisian front. These small observations created early fractures in the psychological armor shaped by German propaganda, which had warned that capture by the Americans meant brutality or slow starvation. Even so, most prisoners dismissed these moments as temporary or superficial, believing that conditions on land would reveal the harsher truth. By early July 1943, when the convoy finally neared the North American coast, tension tightened throughout the holds. Men gathered near ventilation grates to catch faint hints of lingles, distant smells of vegetation, the subtle shift in the ship's motion as it approached harbor. Many steeled themselves for the worst, convinced that the treatment aboard ship had been merely a facade maintained for the Atlantic passage. their anticipatory dread, sharpened by weeks of uncertainty, would soon collide with the unexpected gestures awaiting them on American soil, gestures so small, yet so deeply contrary to their expectations, that even a simple shared cigarette would carry the force of revelation. In June and July 1943, when the Liberty ships and troop transports carrying thousands of Africa Corps prisoners finally eased into the harbors of Norfolk and Newport News, the first glimpse of the American coastline struck the men with a disorienting mix of awe and dread. As the ships crept past breakwaters and into the long fingers of industrial piers, the prisoners crowded near hatches and deck rails, absorbing a scene that contradicted everything they had imagined during the voyage. Towering steel cranes swung overhead with mechanical precision. Longshoremen moved briskly between stacked cargo, and columns of army trucks idled beside warehouses painted with fresh identification markings. The sheer movement, noise, and abundance on display recalled none of the strained and skeletal supply yards they had left behind in Tunisia, where ammunition dumps had been half empty and fuel drums guarded like treasure. This was industrial power made visible, a reminder that they had been fighting an enemy whose production capabilities no desert defensive line could ever match. American MPs guided the prisoners down gangways in organized files. The afternoon heat clung to their uniforms, and the smell of engine oil, hot metal, and distant seaweed blended with the murmured commands of guards, directing them toward temporary reception centers. Here, the process began with a rhythm the Germans recognized from their own army but with a tone they did not. Medical checks, documentation, delousing procedures, and personal searches were conducted not with anger or humiliation but with brisk, almost indifferent professionalism. The men braced instinctively for blows or insults, for anger from guards who had every right to despise them, but none came. Instead, personnel handed them water, recorded their details, and moved on, as if processing enemy soldiers by the tens of thousands were simply another logistical task in a vast war machine. Inside the examination tents and processing buildings, what stood out to many POS was not the treatment but the abundance. Stacks of medical supplies, crates of food, and shelves of clean equipment filled the spaces through which they moved. After months of rationing in Tunisia where bandages were washed and reused, and basic medicines had vanished from frontline kitsy stores seemed excessive, almost surreal. Prisoners recalled later that the sight of so many intact cartons of American field rations left them uneasy, for it reinforced the scale of the imbalance that had doomed their final stand. Between stages of processing, some prisoners caught the drifting smell of American cigarettes. MPs stood near shaded corners of the yards, smoking Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields. The white coils of smoke rising above clipped conversations. Two men who had gone weeks with only a few shared cigarettes. The smell alone was enough to seize their attention. They expected the guards to flaunt tobacco as a privilege or use it as leverage. But the Americans smoked casually, as though cigarettes were simply one more item their vast supply chains provided without strain. Few guards spoke to the POS beyond necessary commands. Yet the ease with which they enjoyed something so scarce in the German ranks delivered another unspoken message. Here was a country that did not feel the war's shortages in the same way their homeland did. By the time the prisoners were formed into groups for transfer, many felt suspended between anxiety and reluctant curiosity. The trains waiting on nearby sidings, their cars marked for destinations deep in the American interior, promised a journey even farther from everything the men had known. As they boarded and the locomotives began pulling westward, the harbors receding behind them, the atmosphere within the cars shifted into a quiet anticipation. Their expectations of brutality had not been met, yet neither had any comfort been offered. The contradictions unsettled them. Ahead lay camps in states they could not yet picture, and with them the gestures and disarming and quietly human that would challenge their assumptions even more directly than anything they had seen on the docks when the eastbound trains gave way to westward lines and the Africa Corps. Prisoners were carried deeper into the American interior. The landscape outside their barred windows shifted in ways that felt almost unreal. The dense forests and industrial corridors near the Atlantic harbors faded into rolling farmland, endless plains, and small towns marked by grain elevators and water towers, features utterly foreign to men who had fought across the dunes and rocky ridges of North Africa. For days, the prisoners watched wheat fields bend in the wind, cattle graze near lonely farmhouses, and roads stretch arrow straight toward the horizon. The vastness of the country unsettled them. It spoke not only of distance from home, but of the scale of the enemy's resources. A nation that could fight a global war while its interior life continued with steady, unhurried rhythm. Their anticipation hardened during the last hours of the journey, each man bracing for the moment when the Americans would finally reveal the harsher treatment they believed inevitable. When the locomotive finally slowed and hissed to a halt beside the sidings of Camp Concordia, Kansas, the men peered through the slats of their rail cars at a complex far larger and more orderly than they expected. Built rapidly earlier that year, the camp stretched across the plains in clean geometric rows. Wooden barracks, mess halls, administrative buildings, workshops, and broad open spaces laid out with mathematical precision. Guard towers rose at intervals along the perimeter, their searchlights and platforms standing silent in the midday heat. Instead of chaos or shouting, the prisoners heard only the steady rhythm of boots on gravel and the crisp commands of MPs organizing under the immense Kansas sky. The camp felt strangely calm, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply functional, as though every inch had been designed for efficiency rather than punishment. The prisoners formed ranks as they were marched toward the intake area. Many expected the mood to darken once processing began, but the American guards maintained a relaxed professionalism that left the Germans unsteady. Guards checked lists, directed men to their barracks, and outlined camp regulations with an indifference that felt alien to soldiers conditioned to expect hostility from their captors. The contrast to the collapsing front lines of Tunisia, where supplies had dwindled, tempers frayed, and every order carried strain, was stark. Here, every action seemed governed by routine rather than emotion. During brief pauses in the orientation process, the first moment of true disbelief arrived. As the prisoners waited near a row of barracks under the open sun, several MPs stepped aside to smoke. They did so casually, leaning against posts or talking among themselves, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the wind. For men who had endured weeks of near-total tobacco deprivation, the drifting smell of American tobacco felt almost taunting. Yet there was no mockery in the guards' behavior. Cigarettes appeared to be nothing more than another commonplace comfort in a country unscarred by supply collapse. Then, in a gesture that none of the prisoners anticipated, one MP noticed a young German private whose hands trembled slightly from withdrawal. Without hesitation, the guard tapped his pack and offered him a cigarette. The private hesitated, glancing toward his comrades as though expecting a trap or humiliation. But the guard merely struck a match and held it steady in the wind. When the private finally drew the smoke into his lungs, his expression shifted from suspicion to stunned relief. The surrounding men watched in silence, realizing that the casual generosity of the moment clashed with every prediction embedded in their wartime upbringing. This small act, mundane to the Americans, profound to the Germans, became the quiet pivot upon which their expectations began to shift. It did not erase their fear, nor did it resolve their uncertainty about the months ahead, but it lodged in their memory as the first undeniable sign that captivity in the United States might not resemble the brutal fate they had imagined. As the men settled into their barracks and the routines of camp life began, the emotional groundwork had already been laid for the deeper surprises and contradictions that awaited them in the days to come. Within days of settling into Camp Concordia, the Afrika Korps prisoners began to understand that the small but startling gesture they had received on a casually offered cigarette was rooted in a deeper cultural and logistical reality of the US Army during the Second World War. To American soldiers, tobacco was not a luxury or an uncertain frontline commodity. It was woven into the rhythm of military life. Each week, service members received generous cigarette rations, often packaged in neat cartons that contained brands familiar across the United States: Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, Old Gold, and occasionally lesser-known regional labels. These allotments were reinforced by Red Cross parcels, which frequently included additional packs, ensuring that even units away from established supply hubs rarely went without. In mess halls, motor pools, and barracks across the country and overseas, cigarettes served as a universal punctuation mark before meals, after long shifts, or during breaks. For many American guards, lighting up was as habitual as taking a drink of water, an act performed without hesitation or significance beyond momentary relaxation. For the German prisoners, the contrast could not have been sharper. During the final months in North Africa, cigarette rations had dwindled to inconsistent and often meager amounts. Supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean faced relentless attacks from Allied aircraft and naval patrols, and even successful deliveries prioritized ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Tobacco, while culturally important within the Wehrmacht, never reached the front line in dependable quantities. Men who had once smoked steadily throughout the early desert campaigns found themselves saving the last fragments of a pack for days, sometimes trading precious rations of bread or jam for a single cigarette. By early 1943, units near the Mareth line spoke of tobacco not as a comfort but as a symbol of how thoroughly their logistical lifelines had collapsed. This disparity meant that when German prisoners saw American guards smoke without hesitation, taking long draws, flicking ash into the dust, speaking casually, as though the supply were limitless, the experience struck them with unexpected force. A single American cigarette, offered without calculation or ceremony, carried symbolic weight far beyond its material worth. It represented stability, abundance, and a level of comfort they had not experienced in many months. The relaxed way in which Americans consumed tobacco communicated, unintentionally but unmistakably, that the war had not constricted their lives in the same existential manner it had constricted German forces in Tunisia. When guards at Concordia shared cigarettes, they did so without ideological motive. seeing the gesture as simple courtesy, a way to pass time or ease another man's tension. But for the POWs, the act chipped away at the psychological framework shaped by years of propaganda that had depicted Americans as merciless, materialistic, or morally degenerate. Here, in the open Kansas wind, the prisoners encountered the opposite: calm, familiarity, and a quiet assumption of equality in small matters. These exchanges soon became a recurring feature of camp life, with cigarettes functioning as a kind of informal currency of goodwill. As weeks turned into months, the significance of this tobacco culture would deepen, subtly altering relationships between guards and captives, and reshaping the Germans' understanding of the society in which they now lived. The cigarette, which had so often represented hardship in North Africa, now became the first gateway through which some prisoners glimpsed the unexpected humanity that defined their American captivity. Then, in the first nights after arrival at Camp Concordia, the barracks buzzed with low, urgent conversations as Afrika Korps prisoners tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. The simple act of an American guard offering a cigarette, a gesture delivered without threat, reward, or hidden intention, became the subject of repeated each man attempting to align the moment with the world he had known only days before. For years, soldiers in North Africa had been warned that surrender to the Western Allies meant torment, starvation, rations, beatings, forced labor meant to grind down morale, and a humiliating loss of dignity. These narratives had circulated through frontline rumor, Nazi newsreels, and field lectures that framed enemy armies as brutal and vindictive. Many of the prisoners had boarded the transport ships across the Atlantic, convinced that their fate would be bleak, perhaps even life-threatening. Yet here in Kansas, the Americans did not behave as the propaganda had promised. The guards issued instructions politely, enforced rules without cruelty, and carried out their responsibilities with an indifference that felt almost surreal to the newly captured men. The cigarette, shared without fanfare, became the symbol of this contradiction. Some prisoners insisted it must be part of a psychological tactica, way to lower defenses before harsher realities emerged. Others argued that the Americans simply did not view the prisoners as enemies in the ideological sense, but rather as soldiers caught in the machinery of war. The confusion was profound. If the warnings had been false regarding this small matter, what else might have been exaggerated or invented? As the days passed, the consistency of the guards' behavior began to erode the suspicion that the first gesture had been exceptional. The Americans continued to behave predictably. They conducted roll calls at the same hours, distributed meals on schedule, and intervened in disputes with measured calm. Medical personnel treated minor ailments without hesitation. Work assignments were explained clearly, with no arbitrary punishments attached. Some guards even offered brief, casual remarks about the weather or baseball scores, comments that revealed how little ideological weight they placed on supervising former enemies. In diaries later kept by former people, these early weeks were described as the moment when the wall began to crack. One entry from a private in a Panzer Grenadier regiment noted that the Americans did not seem to hate us, a realization that unsettled him more deeply than any hardship. Another prisoner wrote that the guards' discipline lacked the harshness he expected. Instead, it resembled a kind of pragmatic professionalism that treated routine as the foundation of order. This predictability generated the first stirrings of security, encouraging some men to mirror the guards' calm by keeping their barracks tidy or cooperating during work details.